This book is hands down the book in the Bible that I would recommend you to read if you haven't read the Bible before. It's very fast paced, it's the shortest of the Gospels, and it doesn't have that many parts that are that hard to understand. One of the Bible commentaries that I have said that Mark was so simple that they almost didn't write anything about it. That's helpful when you try to make a video about the Gospel of Mark. This does not mean, however, that there's nothing to learn about the Gospel of Mark. There's still a lot of interesting stuff that will make you understand this Gospel better, like how it is written to a persecuted group of Roman Christians, and how the ending of Mark isn't really the ending of Mark. So this is what you need to know about the Gospel of Mark. Before we get into who the author is and all of that, we should talk a little bit about the Synoptic Gospels, because this does influence when we date the different Gospels. I don't really like talking about it because I don't find it that interesting, so I'll be quick. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic just means seeing with the same eyes or just similar. This is because they have a lot of the same verses in them. 93% of Mark can be found in either Matthew or Luke. 58% of Matthew can be found in either Mark or Matthew. And 41% of Luke can be found in Matthew and Mark. Or to put it this way, out of the 661 verses that are in Mark, 606 of them can be found in Matthew, and 308 of them can also be found in Luke. So only 31 verses in Mark cannot be found in either Matthew or Luke. This means that they must have used either the same source or they used each other as sources. This gives us the puzzle of trying to figure out who used who as a source. And that also matters when we try to figure out when each gospel was written. Because of this, most scholars believe that Mark was the first of the three to be written. I personally don't really hold that much weight to this because no matter what gospel you think was written first, there's always a way for you to just explain your way around this problem. And I trust more in what the internal evidences in the Bible say and what the early church fathers said. But enough about that. Who wrote this book and why? The author of this gospel is probably Mark. Mark was one of the most popular names in the Roman Empire, so this could be several different people. As the other Gospels, this is technically an anonymous book because the name Mark doesn't appear anywhere. But most people agree that this was written by Mark. Early church fathers tells us that it was written by a guy called John Mark, John being his Jewish name and Mark being his Roman name. And this Mark is mentioned a couple times in Paul's letters and in Acts. A church father called Papias tells us that this gospel was written by John Mark on the reminiscence of the Apostle Peter. It was probably written while they were in Rome, and either right before or right after the death of Peter. This means that it was written during the persecution of Christians by Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero is an interesting character, so let's talk a little bit about him. Emperor Nero started reigning in 54 AD after the death of Claudius, and he reigned until his death in 68 AD. He loved to sing, but he was terrible at it. This did not stop him from singing, however. One time he sang a full 2-hour opera on his own, which cancelled the time for the other contestants and thus crowned him as champion. On several occasions he also took part in chariot racing. One time when he was leading a 10-horse chariot team, he lost his balance, fell off the chariot, had to be helped up, and though he failed to finish, the judges gave him the award anyway. Nero was also a thief. Not because he needed it, of course, because he was the emperor, but just for fun. One of his games would be to stab men on the way back from the tavern and then drop their dead bodies in the sewers. He would also break into the shops of private owners, steal their goods, and set up his own market in the palace, auctioning the things off and wasting away the proceeds. He also killed his own mother, then he killed his aunt, and then he killed several of his wives. He also married a young boy, supposedly because he looked like one of the wives that he had killed, and dressed him up in normal clothes of an empress and drove him around the empire in his own chariot. He also set fire to Rome in 64 AD and saw most of the city burn down. This was probably because he wanted to rebuild the city nearer to his heart's desire. People started pointing their fingers at Nero for starting the fire, so Nero started blaming the Christians for it. And thereby the Roman persecution of Christians started. Christians were sewn up to the skins of animals and hunted by dogs. Some were crucified, and some were dipped in oil and used as human torches. Paul is believed to be beheaded in this persecution, and Peter is believed to be crucified. This is the setting that Mark is writing into. The Christians were persecuted and were probably in constant fear of being caught for being a Christian. How can you share your faith if you could get killed if someone found out that you're a Christian? And how can you love the people that are trying to kill you? That brings us to two of the themes in this book. One of the key themes in this book is how Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. This servanthood did not make Jesus very popular, however, and he was crucified. The followers of Jesus are called to be servants of each other, but also servants of the people that are persecuting them. Just imagine being in Rome when maybe your friend is getting burned on a stick, and you're supposed to serve the people that are doing it. Serving the people you love is easy compared to serving the people you hate. The second theme in this book is Gentile inclusion. First of all, if you don't know what a Gentile is, that's just anyone that is not a Jew. Judaism was very exclusive. They didn't do any sort of evangelism, and their goal was definitely not to convert people into Judaism. In their mind, they were God's chosen people that could trace their heritage back to Abraham. So a key theme in this gospel is how Gentiles are also included. God's love isn't just for one people group, but it is for the whole world. And it is pretty obvious this gospel is written to the Gentiles because some places the author has to explain some of the Jewish traditions. The third theme I will look at is Jesus. This kind of seems like an obvious theme. Isn't like the whole Bible about Jesus? Yes, but this does the basic work of describing three key facts about Jesus that wouldn't be that obvious to a Gentile. Jesus is human, Jesus is God, and Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus will be called the Son of Man and the Son of God. These have some interesting historical and cultural parallels, but that will be for another video. Or you could just check out the Bible Project video. Enough background stuff, let's look at the text. In the first half of the book, Jesus is traveling around in the area of Galilee. Galilee is where Jesus grew up, and it is a bit away from the very Jewish area of Judea and Jerusalem. The towns that Jesus mostly are in has a majority of Jewish inhabitants. And in the start of the gospel, Jesus is mostly ministering to the Jews. He goes and preaches in the synagogues, and he goes and argues with the Pharisees. Chapter 4 is really the only teaching that Jesus has in this book, and it is about the parables about the kingdom. And it's interesting to think about why Mark chose these parables out of all of the parables that Jesus taught. This is the shortest gospel, so Mark is probably just adding the absolute most important stuff that he wants to tell the church in Rome. Why do you think Mark chose these parables to add to his gospel? If you have any thoughts, please comment down below. Your thoughts are probably as good as mine. After Jesus has had this teaching, he goes to the other side of the sea. This starts a section where Jesus will go back and forth between primarily Jewish cities and primarily Gentile cities. When Jesus goes to the other side or comes back from the other side, that marks the transition from Jewish area to Gentile area. So when he goes to the other side, to the Gerasenes, he goes into a Gentile area. Or when he goes to the Decapolis or to Gennesareth. Tyre and Sidon are also Gentile cities, but that is pretty far away, so that's not just to the other side of the sea. But the point is, Jesus goes to the Gentiles too. Remember that Jesus is primarily the Jewish Messiah. He fulfills what is written in Jewish scriptures and would pretty much only make sense to a Jew. Like if my wife got pregnant, don't worry mom, she's not. I wouldn't just start telling random people about it first. I wouldn't stop people on the street telling people about it. First of all, we would just tell our families and our closest friends. People that don't know us wouldn't really care. If the Jewish Messiah has come, that good news probably started with the Jews, because that's the people it would make sense to tell. The fact that Jesus goes to the Gentiles too means that this message is not just exclusive to the Jews. It is for the Jew first, because that's who it makes sense to, but it is also for the Gentile. Imagine if you were a Gentile Christian in Rome and you were literally dying because of your faith in Jesus, and someone told you that Jesus is only for the Jews, and you're not included. If you don't have a Bible to read and you didn't see Jesus with your actual eyes, how are you to know that that's not true? So this is probably why Mark is spending so much time just confirming that Gentiles are included. In chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, we see a pretty weird miracle that Jesus does. He heals a blind man, but it seems like he needs 2 attempts to heal him. Jesus spits on his hand and touches the blind man's eyes, and he can see, but not very clearly. Then Jesus lays his hands on his eyes again, and after that he can see clearly. Why would Jesus need 2 tries to heal this person? Then after that, Jesus goes alone with his disciples and asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say a prophet. Then Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Christ." Do you see the parallels in these stories? A man first just seeing something but not really seeing what it is. And then Jesus opens his eyes so that he can see clearly. People not seeing who Jesus is, but then Peter saying clearly that you are the Christ. This shift marks the division in this book. Before this, the only voices that recognize Jesus for who he really is the author and demons. After this, he's transfigured before some of his closest disciples, and he starts speaking clearly about how he has to die and resurrect. And he stops his ministry in the Galilee area, and he turns around and goes towards Jerusalem and his death. The theme that describes the second half of this book is how hard it is to be a disciple of Jesus, and the attitudes that the followers of Jesus should have. It is the story about the rich young man that had to give away everything to follow Jesus. And it is the story of the disciples being told that the greatest of them has to be a servant. And Jesus repeats again and again that he has to die, and he ends up actually dying. And this whole section is perfectly summed up in Mark 10:45, where it says, "For even the Son of Man came, not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." But before Jesus goes into the whole crucifixion story, Jesus tells his disciples about the days that is to come, how it will be hard, there will be persecution, but Jesus will return in power and in glory. This will probably send such a strong message of encouragement to the church in Rome. Jesus knew that it was going to be hard, but just stay faithful to Jesus and it will all be worthwhile. Then the passion story of Jesus begins. Jesus is on trial before the different authorities. He is mocked and he is crucified before he is raised from the dead on the 3rd day. Now the ending of Mark is pretty special. There are several different endings found in different Greek documents. Most manuscripts that are available for us today include the part from 16 verses 9 through 20. But the earliest manuscripts do not include this part. In fact, the first manuscript that we have that include this part is from the 5th century. This does not mean that it wasn't written until the 5th century. Evidence from the early church fathers suggests that it was already in existence in the 2nd century. But Clement and Origen, which is earlier church fathers, show no knowledge of this gospel ending with anything beyond verse 8. So most scholars believe that this gospel ends at verse 8 and that verses 9 through 20 is added later. This means that this gospel ends with the disciples being astonished after being told that Jesus is risen, but also trembling and too afraid to tell anyone. And that's how it ends. It is a pretty weird place to end, so it does make sense that someone wanted to add a proper ending later. But just think about how this would sound to the disciples in Rome. They were undoubtedly afraid and trembling. How does this book apply to us today? In many ways, but the most obvious thing to me is how we as disciples of Jesus are called to be suffering servants. Not that we're always going to suffer, because we can't determine our own circumstances, but no matter what circumstance, we are called to serve. As even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, so we are also called to be servants of each other. We are called to put other people in front of ourselves. So how can you do that this week? Find a practical way to serve someone. Anyway, that was it for the Gospel of Mark. I hope you enjoyed it. and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you really liked it, please consider becoming a patron. The link is in the description and you can support me however much you want per video I post. I rely on support from you guys to be able to continue making these videos. Or if you just want to watch the videos, that's totally fine too. And again, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next video.